globalization a bad idea?
No. No, I think I think most anarchists are much more in favor of globalization than the people that they oppose.
I'm sorry?
Than the people that they oppose. I don't think the IMF, the World Bank are particularly in favor of globalization in any meaningful sense of the term.
Yeah.
If you think that globalization is the effacement of borders and the free movement of people, possessions, and ideas, let's define it that way, well...
Good idea.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. Yeah. But, I mean, of course, anarchists are opposed to the very existence of international borders because we don't believe in nation-states. At the same time, you know, if you look at what actually happens with globalization, first of all, free movement of people, it's not what it's about at all. I mean, the border guard between U.S. and Mexico has tripled since the signing of NAFTA. And because the way what they call globalization actually works, it's all about trapping people in places where you then remove Social Security, right. Creating people desperate enough to undersell each other, and allow corporations to move around to take advantage of it. I mean, we don't think that's real globalization.
Does anarchy have a future?
I think so. Well, I mean, I think we're at a really interesting historical moment. I think in a lot of ways we've kind of returned to what was happening a century ago. If you think about the sort of classic days of anarchism was 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, up to World War I, basically. That was a period of relative global peace, and it was a period much like the age of globalization. People used to say things like, I remember reading someone writing in 1901 saying, it's hard for us to remember these days that there used to be these things called passports, and people had to show them at borders. I mean, people were just moving around much more freely. The idea of war between what were considered civilized countries seemed to be a thing of the past. And during that period, anarchism became the center of the sort of imaginative revolutionary left. All of a sudden you had World War I, and which was, as everybody represents it, one of the most foolish wars in history. It wasn't really about anything. And suddenly anarchism disappears, and Marxism is everywhere, and it seems much more plausible. But if you think about the reasons for that, it seems to me the 20th century, most historians now think the 20th century ran from about 1914 to maybe 1991. The short 20th century, they sometimes call it. Well, the 20th century was probably the most violent century in human history. It was almost entirely made up of either fighting world wars or preparing for world wars. And during that period, certainly, I would say anarchism didn't look particularly realistic, because the one thing anarchists will never be good at is building gigantic mechanized killing machines, armies. You know, I think that's altogether to our credit. On the other hand, Marxist regimes often, that was about the only thing they were particularly good at. So they were pretty good at it. Yeah. But, you know, you get 1989, 1991, the wall falls, those regimes fall apart. Suddenly you're back at an age where it seems like you're back in the 1890s. It looks like war between industrialized countries is impossible. You have globalization again. Right. Suddenly the anarchists are back. And in a way, it's very funny because in the 90s people were talking about history is over. This is the end of history, nothing will really change. It seems...
Only one person to know about that was Francis Fukuyama was talking about
everybody kept repeating it. Yeah. It's the line they all gave to us. And now it seems exactly the opposite of the case. History is madly accelerated. It's the same things are happening, but much, much faster. So that you have that period, but it only lasts 5 or 6 years, and suddenly global elites seem to panic. You have this massive internationalist movement. It's anarchistic in sentiment. Its ideas are coming out of anarchism, even if most of the people in it aren't themselves anarchists, much like in the 1890s, 1900s. Yeah. And what do? They go off and start a war. I mean, it doesn't really matter who you start a war with. You need to have a war. That's the only way you can really have an excuse to suppress dissent, call in nationalistic sentiments. But in the long term, I don't think it's going to work. I don't think we're going to have another 75 years of world war. I don't think, first of all, it would be possible without blowing up the world. And I think
so you're not, because of the technology?
Yeah.
Therefore you're optimistic about the future?
Yeah, I'm very, very optimistic. I mean, I think that what we're seeing now is a kind of panic reaction of global elites who didn't expect to see this. I mean, it's hard for us to remember now the way they were talking back in the mid-90s. I mean, back in 2000, we thought it was going to take about 10 years to unseat the Washington Consensus, people in the movement.
Now, what's the Washington Consensus?
Well, the idea that essentially that all historical questions, economic questions, political questions are over, that we'll have a certain type of limited parliamentary democracy, but governments won't really decide on economic policy. We'll have these institutions like the IMF and World Bank, certain type of supercharged, what's called neoliberalism in the rest of the world.
I can make an argument easily. The sense of the acceleration of the Internet's impact on us, clearly an international phenomenon.
Certainly.
Is less than 10 or 11 years in terms of its real impact when it began to get momentum, which was around 95. I mean, you can go back and talk about Netscape and a browser and all those kinds of technological innovations. Europe, of course we do. But it made, and then search engines and all the things that have erupted. It's been a very short time, and it's accelerated beyond all of our imagination.
Absolutely, I think you're right. And we have no idea what it would imply. I mean, this is one of the reasons I think something like anarchism is so important to put on our horizons, because it's about trying to reimagine the world, reimagine different ways of relating. And the one thing that we know is history is moving so quickly, things are going to change. The type of capitalism that we have now will not exist in 100 years.
What kind of capitalism will exist in 100 years?
Maybe something very different. We don't know.
Because
there's no way we can know.
It will.
Well, I mean, the one thing we know is that 100 years ago the world was very different.
Into something bigger, better, more powerful, or?
I think that we have no idea. I mean, this is my way of thinking of it. We know that 200 years ago the world was incredibly different. 100 years ago it was very different.
25 years ago it was incredibly
exactly different. I mean, if anything, change is speeding up.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Change is accelerating.
Yes.
The velocity of change is exponential.
The assumption that these questions are answered, that human possibilities are pretty much fixed, I think is absurd. We can't guess what the world is going to look like in 100 years, but we can try to create positive examples of alternatives which can inspire people and provide ways out, because we do know it's going to change. The question is we don't know whether it's going to change for the better or the worse.
Before I end this, what are you going to do?
Myself?
Yeah.
Next year?
Yeah.
Well, Yale has actually offered me a year off at full salary for agreeing to go away. So
now, see, I can't. Can I stop you there for a second? I bet you I could get on the phone and find out why they did not want to renew your contract.
Well,
I bet you I could. No, I just bet I could. But I bet 1,000 other people, not because I have any particular power, but I bet you could. If you really wanted to know, you could find it. Now, you may not agree, and you may think that the premise was false, but you could find out, I bet.
But if I knew, would I say it on television? I mean, you can't say bad things about other professors. I mean, that's taboo.
So what you did was criticize other professors?
No, but I would have if I said it here. That's much worse than...
So you think it was, in the end?
I think in the end, I simply... In academia, there's a hierarchy, and you're supposed to be scared. You're supposed to be sort of cowering before people, and I was never disrespectful to people, but I didn't cower.
What do you mean by cower in this case?
Well, I mean, this is one reason I'm an anarchist. I think that structures of hierarchy, if you give people complete impunity and power over others, it creates a psychological dynamic which is almost sadomasochistic, you know.
Does an anarchy, to be an anarchist is not to respect authority?
No, I think to be an anarchist is to be critical of authority and to always examine
where authority is just by definition.
Well, no, to always examine authority critically to see if it's legitimate.
Yeah.
And I think there are forms of authority that are legitimate, but you don't worship authority as a thing in itself.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, take, I like the notion of self-subverting authority. I think there are certain types of authority which undermine their own basis, and I think those are very